Okay, it's going.
Oh,
Start whenever.
Okay. So today we will be discussing intercultural communication and how communication is affected by culture. So during our presentation today, we're going to be playing a Kahoot game. So if everyone could take a moment to take out their phones and enter in the game pin and a nickname. Okay, so today during our presentation, we are going to be talking about the relationship between communication and culture, the concepts of culture, how culture is unique, and how to improve cultural communication competence. So first off, I'm going to be talking about culture and communication. To understand the relationship between culture and communication, we first need to understand what culture is. Culture is a system of shared values, beliefs, attitudes, and norms that guides what is considered appropriate among an identifiable group. Now pay attention to this. Culture, at the heart of all culture is its values. There are two different kinds of cultures, real and ideal. Real values are values that a person practices in their daily lives, and ideal values are values that someone wishes they would have or believes that they have. An example of this is the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution's real values are different than its ideal values. An example of its ideal values is that it says it gives everyone equal rights and opportunities. This is not true. Its real values are that some people are discriminated against and not given equal rights and opportunities because of their race, sex, age, etc. So next, I'm going to be discussing intercultural communication, which refers to the interactions between two people whose cultures vary so much that it interferes with their communication. A result of intercultural communication can lead to culture shock, which is the psychological discomfort that someone experiences when they're introduced into a new culture. And lastly, I'm going to talk about how culture is transmitted and modified through communication. An example of this is how we eat and how we address adults. The first example of how culture is modified is through how we eat. In Western cultures, many of us use forks, knives, and spoons and other utensils, while in Eastern cultures, they mainly use chopsticks. The second example of how culture is modified and transmitted through communication is through how we address adults. In past generations, young children were taught to address their family friends by Mr. and Mrs., and now today we address our family friends by first names. Now let's play the Kahoot game.
The second section we will be discussing is dominant cultures, co-cultures, and cultural identity. Dominant culture is the learned system of norms held by the majority group of empowered people. Before 1960, the dominant culture in America was characterized as privileged white Western European, English-speaking Protestant heterosexual men. Immigrants were supposed to embrace the dominant culture. They were expected to learn English as soon as they could and use it in place of their native language. Some people even changed their name to sound more American. The dominant culture has gradually become less accepted because people respect and honor the diversity of cultures. Cultures can now coexist without having to conform to each other. In addition to dominant culture, a person may identify with one or more co-cultures. A co-culture is a group consisting of a smaller number of people who hold common values, beliefs, attitudes, and customs that differ from those of the dominant culture. Co-culture can influence communication behavior in a variety of ways, one of which being a code switch, which means someone alters their linguistic and nonverbal patterns to conform to the dominant or co-culture. An example of this would be my grandma. When she speaks to her employees, she speaks only English. If she speaks to relatives in other countries on the phone, she'll speak only Italian. And if she speaks to my grandpa or my dad, she'll use a mixture of both English and Italian. Everyone has a unique cultural identity. The part of our self-concept that is based on how closely we associate with both the dominant culture and various co-cultures is our cultural identity. Me personally, I identify my dominant culture with being American and my co-culture with being Croatian and Italian. People can embrace their co-cultures through communication patterns, religion, food choices, and a variety of other ways. Co-culture in the United States is formed around shared beliefs and values related to, you might want to pay attention to these, race, ethnicity, sex and gender, sexual orientation, religion, socioeconomic status, age or generation, and disability. Race is characterized by skin and eye color, hair texture, and body shape. We define ethnicity with ethnic heritage. An example would be a first-generation individual in a culture will identify more with their ethnic heritage than a fourth-generation individual. People are taught to learn gender based on sex. At a young age, girls are taught to act like a lady and boys are told to be a man. The sexual orientation dominant culture in America is heterosexual, but people are slowly becoming more accepting of sexual orientations. For religion, dominant culture values religious freedom. Socioeconomic status is broken into three categories: high, middle, and low, with the middle class being the most common, which is what most people identify with. Age or generation means people who grew up during the same time period. And lastly, disability is any physical, emotional, mental, or cognitive impairment that impacts how a person functions in society. Now let's play Kahoot again. I hope you were paying attention.
Thirdly is how cultures differ. There are 7 main ways to how communication can help cultures differ. Pay attention for later in the game. The first main way a culture can differ by communication is in individualism and collectivism. Individualism values rights and responsibilities. They also value self and personal achievements. For example, they go to their family and friends to make the final decision because they have similar interests. In a collectivistic culture, they value community collaboration, shared interests, harmony, the public good, and avoiding embarrassing moments. They focus on group and group harmony. For example, they only make decisions that are best for the group. They both value self-concept and self-esteem, group decisions, and they take care of business on their own terms. Another way cultures can differ in communication is context. Context is how members rely on contextual cues to relay a message. There are 2 types of context called low and high context. In low context cultures, they use words to communicate the meaning of the message. In high context cultures, they understand from the context, also known as reading between the lines. This means that the purpose of the message is indirectly shown by referencing the unwritten cultural rules and subtle nonverbal behaviors. Next on the list is chronemics. Chronemics is a study of how perception of the time differs in each culture. There are 2 types, monochronic and polychronic. In monochronic cultures, they view time as a series of small units that occur continuously. They are strict and on time to everything. In polychronic cultures, they view time as a continuous flow. They can do multiple things at once. They value relationships over their schedules. The 4th way that communication varies in different cultures is in uncertainty avoidance. Uncertainty avoidance is the extent of which people have the desire to predict what will happen. There are 2 types, low and high uncertainty avoidance. In low uncertainty avoidance, they are less driven to control unpredictable people, relationships, or events. They also focus on having less rules. But in high uncertainty avoidance places, the people focus on having high-driven control on unpredictable people, relationships, or events. They have created systems of formal rules with more security and reduce the risk of anything bad happening. The fifth way that a culture can communicate differently is in power distance. Power distance is how members of a culture expect and accept that power will be equally and unequally distributed. There are two types, high and low. In high power distance cultures, they view unequal power distribution as normal, but in low power distance cultures, they view power to be more equally distributed. When you think of authority, they view that as a higher position, but they treat them no differently. An example would be that in a low power distance culture, they would go up to the teacher and talk about a grade distribution that they didn't like. But in a high power distance culture, they would never think of doing that. These two naturally affect how we interact with one another. The sixth way that communication can differ in each culture is in masculinity and femininity. In a masculine culture, men and women are treated traditionally. Think of the traditional man and wife household. Females look up to the men's performance, ambitions, and competitiveness, and the women are the nurturing ones. In a feminine culture, there are a variety of roles and valued regardless of their sex. They have the same amount of roles. They are both nurturing, caring, service-oriented, ambitious, and they have good performance traits and are competitive. Lastly, the seventh way that a culture can communicate differently is long-term and short-term orientation. In short-term orientation, they value rewards in the here and now moments. They are focused on having quick results, fulfilling social obligations, and getting to the bottom line. They value leisure time separate from work. In a long-term orientation, they emphasize potential future rewards realized after slow and steady determination achieving an acceptable result. They focus on raising up friendships more than the bottom line. An example would be a person at the dinner table discussing work would get shut down by someone in a short-term orientation, because that's just not allowed. Now it's time to test your knowledge and play some Kahoot.
The fourth section in this chapter was on developing intercultural communication competence. The first topic I'm going to talk about are the 6 potential barriers that most people come across when first interacting with someone of another culture. The first is anxiety. This is where someone feels discomfort, fear, or distrust of another person of a different culture. The second is assumed similarities and differences. Assumed similarities is where someone of one culture thinks that every norm in their culture is across every culture. And the assumed difference is thinking that the two cultures have nothing to do with each other. An assumed similarity example is someone from America traveling to Mexico or Spain. They don't know that the shops and restaurants close early because they observe a siesta, otherwise known as a nap. Third is ethnocentrism. This is where one culture thinks they are superior to another's. The fourth is stereotyping. This is where you assume that every member in a group is the same. The fifth is incompatible communication codes. This is where groups come up with codes that are understood by co-cultures but not by outsiders. For example, Great Britain says lift, where in America we say elevator. Another example of this is some people say pop, others say soda. The sixth barrier is incompatible norms and values. So what one culture thinks is a cultural norm or is highly valued could be highly offensive to other cultures. For example, Vietnamese eat dog, where in America people think that that's gross. We eat cows, but Hindus worship cows. The second topic I'm going to talk about are the competent communication strategies, and there's 3 ways to obtain them. You might want to pay attention to this first section because it could show up later. The first is to acquire accurate knowledge, and there's 2 main ways of doing this. The first is through formal study. This is books, periodicals, interviews. And then the second is observation. And there's 2 different types of observation. There's non-participant observation, which is just watching other members of a different culture interact. And then there's immersion or participant observation, which is working or living with someone of a different culture. The second strategy is to adopt an appropriate attitude, and there's 3 ways to do this. The first is to tolerate ambiguity, which is being okay with the unknown aspects of the culture. The second is to be open-minded. There's no right or wrong when it comes to their culture. The third is to be altruistic, and this is a display of genuine, unselfish concern for the welfare of others. The third strategy is to develop culture-centered skills, and there's 3 ways to achieve this. The first is to practice listening. The second is to practice intercultural empathy, which is placing yourself in the other person's situation and feeling what they're feeling in that experience. And the third is to develop flexibility. This is the ability to adjust your communication to fit the other person and the situation you're in. Now let's play Kahoot. In conclusion, we have gone over culture and communication, specifically the basic concepts and relationships between them, the dominant cultures, co-cultures, and cultural identity, the different kinds of culture, how cultures differ, what makes cultures unique, and how to develop intercultural communication competence.